Okay, looks like we're about ready to get going again. Just a reminder in case people can't read the schedule. What we're doing in this section is giving the public to ask questions or make comments to the panel members or the consultants, things that you'd like clarified. We are taking questions either from TV or the web. I think the email address is tabrian, that's with a Y, at keystone.org. And members of the local audience, if you can just come forward and step up to the microphone, and if you'd start off by stating your name and affiliation, we'd appreciate it. I guess also at this point I should ask that people put their cell phones on vibrate. It'll cut down on the disturbance, and it's fun to watch you guys jump when they go off. So I have several questions, and I've decided that I'm a member of the public, so I will save them for lulls. But in the meantime, is there anybody that wants to get us started? Yeah, Harry, could you start with your name and affiliation again?
Harry Koshikov from Dalton, and I was wondering, these guys that's doing the studying, did they ever take any local people out? Or when they go on the Iliamna side, do they ask anybody that knows the channel and what time of the year they do their studies? And is there any sheep in that area, or any other animals besides bears, or is there any clams around there? Are they doing the study where they're gonna? Is that the only place they're gonna have the pork, or is there any other place?
So your questions are mostly about the port site?
Yes, and if they ask any local people that, when they were doing the study, did they take them along, or did they ask them?
Okay. So, yeah, Bob, can you talk about local involvement in the studies, and then about sheep and clams and things at the port site?
I can answer part of this, and that is that no, we did not. When we were doing the boat-based surveys, we came in and out of Homer and across that way. In fact, the first 4 years of the study, I'd never even set foot in Iliamna because I was doing the boat-based work. Now that we're starting to do the helicopter work, we fly in and out of Iliamna, from there out into Iliamna, and then we go out to the coast in the helicopter and do the surveys. We haven't taken locals with us mostly because of space. We have to take emergency gear with us. We have 2 biologists and we have a pilot. So basically the fourth seat in the helicopter is taken up by emergency equipment in effect. I would love to talk to folks who spend time out on the coast. It's never been clear to me how many people go out to the coast and harvest animals out there. So I'd love to find out what some of you know about that area. It would be very interesting for me. In terms of things such as clams, I've heard rumors that there are clams, like razor clams out there, but I'm not doing any of that marine work. I think the guys who might have been part of one of these panels last fall, I assume, John Houghton and those guys for Pentec, were doing the marine invertebrate and marine fish work. So I have no direct knowledge, but I have heard stories of people claiming that there are razor clams out there on the flats.
I can speak to that a little bit. We, in our aerial surveys for terrestrial mammals, we did include early on in 2004 and 2005, we included some local folks from New Halen and Pedro Bay. And then, of course, Chinitna Bay is a well-known area for clams, for razor clams. A lot of people go out there to dig razor clams. People fly in, and there's some fishing camps up there. Farther down in Iniskin Bay, as Bob mentioned, there have been other marine a lot of marine surveys done there, looking at invertebrates, clams and crabs and things like that, and it's a fairly rich area, as my understanding. An interesting thing is that brown bears along the coast are known to dig clams in some places, but there was only one observation that we're aware of a bear doing that in Niskin Bay, versus up in Chinitna Bay. It's much more common to see them doing that. So I don't know if that reflects the difference in clams in the the mudflats, or if it's a difference in the behavior of the bears. But that's just an observation. Sheep, we have not surveyed in the mountains for sheep. They're known to occur in Lake Clark National Park, pretty much north of the area that we're talking about. We never saw any sheep when we were flying back and forth between the coast and Iliamna, or the north side of the lake. Other mammals, we did have incidental sightings of moose, black bear, river otter, red fox, wolverine, wolf out on the coast. And then I think there was a question about other port sites, and I'll let Charlotte answer that.
Yeah, at this point, we don't have a port site identified. We've mainly focused the marine studies in the EBD and the Iliamna and Niskin Bay areas, so we could look at that area to help us determine what might be the better port site in the area. We've also been expanding studies for alternatives analysis further down the coast a bit as well.
Yeah, and if you could start with your name and affiliation.
My name is, ooh, gosh, really loud. My name is Taryn Kiko, and I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I apologize if you've covered this in the morning because I was unable to make it, but I just have a couple of observations and a couple of questions about Cook Inlet belugas. First, in the EBD, it notes that there was critical habitat proposed. NIMS actually did designate, the National Marine Fisheries Service did designate it back in 2011. So whenever the EBD gets updated, you'd certainly want to note that wherever the port is going to go, it will be right in the middle of critical habitat for Cook Inlet beluga whales. Second, just looking through the EBD, there was a noise survey done for terrestrial wildlife. And I'm curious, when NIMS actually designated critical habitat for Cook Inlet belugas, they made noise one of the PCEs, the primary constituent elements, for critical habitat designation. And I'm wondering why there wasn't surveys done of in-water noise levels that would impact belugas. Obviously, things that would be concerned would be not just the building of a port, but the increase in ships, in pollution, and other things that are currently impacting it. And that goes to my third question as to, was there a reason why other issues weren't addressed? Obviously, Cook Inlet belugas, there was a population estimate done. You probably just took the number from NIMS, but why you didn't look at some of the other issues that would be facing Cook Inlet belugas that would be exacerbated by like the current baseline, what are the noise levels, what are the ships in and out, what is the pollution level in the proposed port sites, and how would that be increased, with the proposed mine? And I can sit down after that, but I do have one more question about seals.
Okay. I think this will probably be a tag team between the ABR people and Charlotte McKay. So maybe let the ABR people go first.
All right, thanks. Yeah, you speak pretty fast, so my pencil's smoking here. I'm trying to write the notes down so fast. The first one was that there's a need to note the critical habitat for beluga has been designated in 2011. Yes, I agree. That designation was changed after we finished the EBD, and we will update that in future documents. And then the second one was why no in-water noise levels were sampled for belugas. And then the third one was, what, if I understand correctly, what other issues that may affect belugas in the port site, and were they or are they going to be sampled? Excuse me. To my knowledge, there have been no baseline data studies on natural noise levels in this area because, as Charlotte said, at this point, they haven't even nailed down a port site. I think once the port site gets set down, my understanding of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, I would assume that some sort of noise level measurements will have to be made, but I don't know that for certain. Perhaps Charlotte can speak to that more strongly.
Yeah, I can pretty much just agree with pretty much everything you just said. One, that we recognize it's critical habitat, and future reports will reflect that. We're not updating this particular publication. We're just doing additional cumulative reports in the future, but we'll make that very clear. And it is, I mean, at the mine site, you know where your deposit is, and you set a big study area around it, and you can do a lot of things that reflect that region. For the port site, that's much more variable where that could end out. And so we haven't done as intensive studies for port sites till we figure out where it will be. And pollution and those things, I mean, there are sediment studies, there are water quality studies, there are a lot of things that are done there that just aren't part of the ABR studies or part of previous studies that were covered in previous sessions. So I think there's more data there than reflected just in what's discussed today.
I'll just do a quick follow-up on my seal question. So when I was reading through the EBD, and I'm talking about the Iliamna Lake harbor seals, so one of the sentences just really popped out at me, and that sentence was, and I'll quote, "Despite the fact seals are present year-round, the Iliamna Lake population may not be as isolated as it might appear." And then it went on to discuss insufficient evidence of geographic isolation, and I'm just wondering what led to that conclusion.
I wrote that. The reason is that it's connected. It's readily connected to Bristol Bay without any real barriers to the Kwijak River. Even in one of the well-known harbor seal populations on the east side of Hudson Bay, there's dispute over whether those seals are really isolated or not. It's hard for me to believe that they're not, because there are several waterfalls in between the bay and the lakes that they're in, but there's been some dispute about that. So it was simply noting that it's not known whether seals move in or out of the lake. Since more surveys have been done and folks have looked there in the winter, some of the investigators have speculated it's like, gosh, well, this, it's complete ice cover at times. They must leave. Some people are wondering how much interchange there is between the lake and Bristol Bay, if there even is any. It's not known. So Courtney Gomez is probably not here, but she can speak to that a little bit. She's involved in the ongoing research with National Marine Mammal Laboratory and the University of Alaska, Anchorage. And that involves some tissue samplings from harvested seals, and genetics is one of the things that they're looking at. We were just talking about that at a break. So that's certainly something that should reveal, if there's isolation in that population. The descriptions by local people would seem to indicate that they are different. They talk about them being larger, and they do seem to pup later than they do in the marine environment. So those are some tantalizing hints that they might be an isolated population, but it hasn't been nailed down. It would be really great to get some satellite tags on some of those animals too. I don't know if, well, Charlotte's smiling. I'm not proposing that, Charlotte. I'm sure the National Marine Mammal Lab would like to do it.
Maybe some folks in the audience know. I thought there had been some observations of seals actually in the Kwijak River. I don't know if they're moving upstream or downstream, but I think fishermen have seen them there in recent years, suggesting perhaps some movement. We don't know if they're going all the way out to Bristol Bay. We don't know if those seals are from Bristol Bay, foraging in the Kwijak and turning around and going back downstream. many unknowns, but there's certainly a pathway there for connection of Ileana lake seals to saltwater.
Hi, my name's Sharon Wilson. I work for Pebble, but I'm also a commercial fisherman. And I used to live up on Lake Iliamna, and we'd travel down to the Kwijak, Naknek is where we fish at. And we do see seals in the Kwijak River. We've seen them up as far as where my brother-in-law has a cabin, and we've also seen them up at the braids that are below Igiagig.
Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you.
If you could start with your name and affiliation.
My name is Fari. I'm a UAS student. I'm a graduate student over here. My question to you guys, and I've listened to several of you speak this morning, in regard to some of the decrease in some of these species, endangered species. I know there's some type of preservation as far as maintaining some of these species, but as times is changing and the global warming is affecting a whole bunch, what do you guys think? Times are getting harder, people are getting more in need as far as maintaining their lifestyles, eating good meals actually. What do you think should be done in this case to kind of help preserve the preservation that has already been started to perpetuate to other generations to come? Because we know things are going to change. As they have not yet changed, people are going to want to reach out for some of these species. So what is your take on that?
Sounds like something panel members could weigh in on as well.
Let me start very quick. Just two keywords. Yeah, there will be change. It will be probably quite dramatic, certainly in the high Arctic. And we will have coastal sea level rise. And just the notion of sea level rise hasn't been raised so far. But when the sea level change, that will certainly have many implications for the entire coastal ecosystem. I'll leave it there. But.
Anyone else?
Well, I'm here.
Oh, you got a question?
Well, I can't reach the mic, but maybe I can talk loud enough.
Okay.
Hear me okay?
Yeah, I could probably repeat it too. Oh no, we've got a handheld mic. Just a second. Yeah, and again, if you'll start with your name and your affiliation, that'd.
My name is Carl Jensen, and I lived all my life around Pedro Bay.
Hang on just a second, Carl. We got a microphone for you. Doesn't sound like it.
That's all right.
Okay, there we
I got
go.
something. I know there was a glitch there. I lived in Pedro Bay area all my life. I'm 84 years old now, and we lived subsistence all these years. Of course, it's getting now, so it's kind of hard to do. But I know that the seal stays on the lake, because any time during the winter, if there's a hole, they'll come up. How they survive without air, I don't know. But there's a theory that, of course, a seal, you know, could blow a bubble and live on that for a day. Now, they claim that, you know how the lake will freeze at high water in the fall, and then it'll drop. And so that'll leave a lot of space around, and that's where they claim they live. Because I've seen them with the pups as soon as the lake was out. And Also on the clams in Iliamna Bay, there's butter clams between Iliamna Bay and Cottonwood. They're real good. We used to go over there and put them up, eat them. Then, of course, you don't get your razor until you go up Chinetna Bay or that area. That's about it.
Thanks, Carl. I don't know if everybody's aware of this, but the Jensens have been very hospitable to a bunch of researchers and graduate students over the year, including me about 15 years ago. So thanks.
And we had Carl along on some of our aerial surveys in the early days of this. I mean, he was a young man of 74, so.
Yeah, it looks like
he was a real source of great local knowledge, of course. And I just wanted to mention that the idea about, in fact, I had a sentence in here in the report about the potential for using under ice chambers as lake levels drop during the winter has also been suggested in northern Canada and one of these populations in the east side of Hudson Bay as a possibility. And you're right. I mean, any time that I had these guys when they were flying helicopter surveys going to and from the coast, between Iliamna and the coast, I'd ask them to look for seals on the lake, and almost any time there's a crack, they could get a picture of them in the wintertime. So that suggests to me that they weren't leaving the lake.
Pete, did you have a point?
I've been doing some thinking about the previous question, which really went unanswered by this gentleman over here, about what our thoughts might be about how we go about protecting or perpetuating threatened and endangered species in the face of global warming. And we talked yesterday a little bit about global warming and what it might mean for any site study like this, because things change over time, and if you have a long-term study, you may have to consider some of these changes. That's a tough one that people have been struggling with, but one thing comes to mind immediately. In a previous slide up here, you saw critical habitat designations. As you have increasing temperatures, melting ice, etc., the habitat utilized by species is going to change. And what you have to do with threatened and endangered species, obviously, is to do some type of monitoring so you know how they're adjusting their habitat. If their habitat use shifts, you have to revisit the critical habitat designation. You may have to modify that. So that could be a moving target. It might move up the coast somewhere. It might spread out inland. Because these changes are going to occur, and you're going to have species moving. Down in the lower 48, where I live, there are many examples of species migrating north. Everything from mosquitoes to birds, to ticks, things that weren't in certain areas before are moving. And it's all been in the last 10 to 20 years. So if one of those ticks was an endangered species, you'd have to say that their critical habitat is moving with them. So if you want to protect them, you have to be flexible. And I can think of no other thing to do except that, because you can't stop what's happening. You can't change direction with temperature change. It just isn't going to work. We can't stop it in its tracks. And these things are going to happen, so we have to adjust to it. We can't stop it.
Yeah, I mean, the reason you didn't get better answers was because people didn't know how to answer. But there are some, there's an effort that's been organized by the University of Alaska Fairbanks called the Scenarios Network for Alaska Planning that has projected future change in a number of different climate variables, and that's the kind of information that we as biologists take to try and predict changes in habitats. With regard to the threatened and endangered species in the area that we're talking about, they're all marine species in an area that already has extreme water level fluctuations, tidal fluctuations on a daily basis. So they may be able to adapt to that. But one of the things that people need to consider also with global warming is increasing acidification of the ocean, and that's one that is a big area of concern, and could potentially have greater impacts on their habitat than rising sea level or something like that. But it's difficult. I mean, you have these scenarios. You can try and predict the changes, but it's there's a lot of uncertainty.
There's also the issue of the health of any given target species. Classic example of that would be the amphibian decline throughout the world, really, and we only became aware of that maybe 20 years ago. And there are all sorts of theories were put out, but now it looks like a major part of that is parasites of various kinds, such as funguses, have taken a terrible toll, and the speculation is that maybe the gradual warming climate has made amphibians more vulnerable to these disease agents, which were always there, but they were not dominant, and now they are. So you have that aspect of it also. Again, you have to constantly monitor to see what's going on.
Terrestrially, you can also expect with climate change, changes in vegetation. We're already seeing that with the white spruce and the beetles, and up on the north slope, the willows are following the rivers out to the coast, and following the willows are the moose, and so we're finding moose in areas that where they weren't before. And any of this monitoring work that we're doing, we have to realize is a snapshot of what we see here now, and it's going to, and as things change, we're going to have to stay on top of it and understand not only why things are changing, but the result of those changes on the landscape.
All right, I think we're ready for another question.
Phil North, unaffiliated.
You say that so happily.
I know. Working at EPA was a great career, but it's also nice to be going on to new adventures. So I have mainly comments. And,
okay.
What we've heard in all of these sessions is the work of very good survey work, very good surveys, pretty thorough surveys. Generally, I guess we've got some disagreements on methodology, but overall, I'd say very good surveys. But as has also been stated by Charlotte and others, is that these are surveys, and there's a lot more work that still needs to be done. So this isn't the end of it. I think on the television commercials, there's the impression that we've got all this information, and so we're ready to go. But really, there's just a great deal more information that needs to be collected. And to that end, I guess I want to make a suggestion, is that the inventory work that's been done is probably essential, but it's really, I won't say that it's useless, but it's not very useful without linking it to an ecosystem, so that you really have a description of the ecosystem. So that includes taking that inventory work and then describing the processes that link all the biological and physical and chemical work or inventory that's been done. And that's a whole different set of work to be done. Some of that you can do from the literature that exists, but a lot of that literature comes from other places where there's really probably different processes going on here. But that work, understanding those processes and those links is going to be really important to be able to elucidate what kind of impacts any development will have whether it's a large mine or just, you know, general development, more people moving into the watershed. So I guess that's the main comment that I wanted to make, is just that this is really just the beginning of work that needs to be done. Also, it sounds like, I just wanted to follow up on the first comment that was made by a member of the audience, and that is the idea of getting local knowledge and using that in your study design. It really probably should have been done at the very beginning, before any studies were designed, especially when you're inventorying plants and animals. And it sounds like some of that has been done, but perhaps it can be made a point to incorporate local knowledge and study designs from here on. So that's all I have.
Thanks, Phil. So anybody have any reactions to either of Phil's 2 points?
Yeah, I would just like to say that I agree with the idea of trying to link together a lot of this information. Obviously, my interest is in the marine system. Some guys have been doing some very interesting work out there on marine fishes and on invertebrates that are out there. One of the things that I find very interesting, I mean, this place sometimes has enormous numbers of sea otters. Sea otters require about 20 to 25% of their body weight per day they have to eat. You're talking, we have a max count of 1,400 sea otters in this area. The amount of prey that are taken out of this fairly small area, it has to be in the thousands and thousands of pounds a day. What is it? I don't know that part of it, and I hope to spend time talking to the other marine guys who live in the Seattle area about this, to try to understand a little bit better. Birds are the same way. Birds have very high metabolisms and require around 20 to 25% of their body weight per day on average. It's again, when you're talking several thousand birds in an area, it's a pretty substantial amount of some sort of marine food that's coming out of this system. So it's got to be a pretty productive system, it seems to me. But exactly the main features of how that system works, I admit that I don't have a very good understanding, and it's going to enhance my understanding of why these birds are doing what they're doing. The other thing that I'm interested in is in comparative marine communities, and one of the things that I've seen in the work I've done around Alaska, especially in the fall and winter, is all of these areas that I've worked in are dominated by sea ducks, but different species predominate in different areas, and I don't really understand why one area has more scoters and another area has more harlequin ducks, for example. It's something that I need to understand to give me, I think, a more well-rounded understanding of why the system works the way it does. So I agree, and thank you for your comment.
Yeah, I'll just offer the observation also that that integration among disciplines is a really desirable thing from my perspective as a scientist, and it's often rare because these projects are, usually on some kind of a schedule, and you get a huge number of specialists pursuing their own work, and I always find myself wanting more time to interact with other people and kind of talk about that, exactly the points you're making. I won't look at Charlotte. See what she's.
All right. Next question.
Hello, I'm Suzanne Little. I work with Pew Charitable Trust. I appreciate that this study was significant, took lots of years, and examines the Iliamna watershed. I was wondering if you could tell me why the Bristol Bay watershed wasn't selected for study, and if it is going to be in the future. I also see that as a critical piece or a critical set of information that would be useful to all of us.
Charlotte, is that a question for you? And Suzanne, just to be clear, are you talking about the saltwater portion of Bristol Bay?
Okay. Thank you. That's why I was hesitating coming up. I didn't quite cut the question. Primarily, Bristol Bay is very, very shallow, and it's just not really seen as a probable site to put a port. It's very shallow. You have the fishing industry there, and we've focused on Lower Cook Inlet, which is much deeper.
More questions? Yeah, just a reminder to start off with your name and affiliation.
James Dickinson, lifelong Alaskan. Quick question. I realize that the scientific study is very extensive. Have you guys ever seen any other resource project that has been similar levels of work? What should, as stakeholders, be looking for when evaluating this large volume of scientific work?
Guidance for stakeholders, anybody? How to wade through this stuff?
I don't know if you want to speak first, but for me, I think that's my motivation here really is there needs to be reliable and sound baseline information using according to the best scientific standards. And if it's not done that well, then it should be mentioned so that we have something to go for or to go by. So making sure that the baseline data is number one there, that it actually is what it's meant to be, like the abundance question is essential, and that it is really done sound and nothing is overlooked. And if it is, then it should be flagged that way and should say these are the best we have, however it's missing these components. So just, as transparent, as quantitative as possible. My own view always is that this stuff needs to be open access. It needs to be in the public, it needs to be accessible, it needs to be online, that people can evaluate what has actually been claimed. That's my statement.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to recommend to you a book of some age at this point. It's called Filters Against Folly: How to Survive Economist, Ecologist, and the Merely Eloquent. It was written by Garrett Hardin. I don't remember the year, but it's been probably 15 or 20 years ago, at least that. And the three filters that he suggests for citizens and scientists are literacy, numeracy, and what he coined ecology. And the literacy was, what are the words? What does the project say it's going to do and be? The numeracy was, what are the numbers? And do the numbers match the words? Now, frequently in reports of this nature that come out, the numbers are buried in the appendices. And so you have to dig around a little bit to find the real numbers. But see, do the numbers match what the words say? Sometimes they don't. And then for ecology, what that means is you're then asking the ecologist question, and then what happens? What happens after you build the project or the development or whatever it is in time? Because the engineers think of things that they measure in weeks and months and maybe years, but the ecologists talk about years and decades is what's going to happen. And if you think of evaluating the project with those three tools, I think it'll really help you understand what to look for and what to read into what you've got.
Anybody else?
What was the title of that book? Filters Against Folly. And the author was Garrett Hardin.
Start with your name again.
Hello, my name is William Trifon Sr. I've been here just earlier today. We were talking about habitat now, and moose habitat, fish habitat, and all kinds of habitat. And on this project, are we going to be bothering a lot of animal habitat, and are we doing something about it to make sure we don't bother them too much? I just want to know, and I'd like to know, there's some, like moose, like Anchorage. You build here just to be moose habitat one time. And did the moose move out when people started moving here? They move out for a little while, but they move back. You go down the street and you get a moose if you want to right now. So I was just kind of wondering about that. Are we really going to move, the animals out of their habitat? And like even I mentioned earlier, jobs. The habitat for the people is back there, but they're moving too. So there's something wrong. So I just want to know about, are we, moving things out of their habitat so they can move back, or it's still there and it still could be used?
Okay, I think Charlotte McKay wants to take a stab at that.
At this point, we don't have the project and we don't have the mitigation plans and we don't have the minimization plans. But that's a lot of why we do the habitat studies, is so we know where the habitat is. We can try to design the project as much as possible so that we do minimize impacts. We'll obviously have some effect, and that's what will come out of the impact analyses that the NEPA process will do.
Andy?
Yeah, I'd just like to make a couple comments with that, in those regards. Yes, you're going to, anytime you develop a wild area, you're going to disturb wildlife and by disturbing their habitat. If you put in a road or a railroad corridor, you're going to be crossing through their habitat, and they're going to have to respond to a variety of disturbances like traffic, noise, contaminants associated with the road system, or in the case of an urban area or facilities associated with a mine, you're going to be displacing a certain number of species. Some won't want to live there anymore because of the noise or the activity associated with those areas. They're going to leave. Others will be drawn in, such as bears, ravens, red fox, and others that are curious and are also looking for food. And there's been many documented cases of species that have become urbanized and as a result of anthropogenic disturbances. So I think that's something that does need to be considered in the future, is what the impacts of increasing urbanized wildlife. How are you going to deal with bears coming into the mine site? Bears being probably closer to villages, as well as red foxes and ravens being associated with human activities. Those are fairly inevitable consequences.
And that type of an analysis will be done in the environmental impact statement preparation. Probably not by us, because we're working on the baseline for the Pebble project, and the EIS will be led by a federal agency, and they will engage a separate contractor so that people affiliated that have done work for Pebble won't be doing the actual impact analysis. But typically that's the way that type of an analysis would be done, would be to take the mapping, the habitat mapping that's been done so far, and to use a geographical information system, overlay the various project components on a map like that, so you can see, if there's a road built, what kinds of habitat will be covered up, and then you can apply different buffer distances related to what you know about distances at which different species react to certain activities. And so all that is typically done in an impact analysis. And then Charlotte mentioned mitigation measures. That just means what things can you do to reduce the impacts. And for instance, with bears, there's a standard series of best practices for industry to control garbage, to control any kind of attractive substances, oils, things like that. And that's been pretty well worked out So all of those kinds of things will be considered when they get to the impact analysis stage of this project.
I'm going to take my prerogative and sneak in a question of my own. This is probably a question for Bob. I'm wondering about the seal counts. You start off by counting seals for a pretty broad stretch of the season, then kind of at the end it looked like you were heading for August peak counts. And you mentioned visibility correction using covariates, and you measured visibility correction using tags. And I guess I'm wondering where you ended up. Are you going with August peak counts? Are you doing visibility corrections? And if so, what methods are you using?
Yeah, these did not involve visibility corrections. They involved corrections for a couple of other environmental variables. One is the date. Numbers tend to increase in a predictable pattern over the course of the year, what we call a Julian date. And then I believe the other factor was
Time to low tide.
Time to low tide.
And time to midday.
And time to midday.
These are all things that have been found to affect numbers of seals hauled out in other areas of Alaska. So there's a number of different models that have been developed.
Yeah, so are those that you're developing site specifically, or are you using the correction factors that like the NIMS survey is using? Where are your corrections coming from?
Those were done based on literature and on what we actually generated in terms of analyses, in terms of significant factors. Then there was a final correction that was applied, and that was to the percentage of seals that are in an area that are not actually hauled out at any given time. And I think that was done by NIMS, some folks from NIMS, or was it Fish and Game?
There was, well, I'm not sure exactly which Alex used, but there was a concurrent study in this area by the National Marine Mammal Lab as an MMS-funded study in which they had satellite-tagged seals available. Okay. So they looked at
so they did
proportion
surveys.
of time hauled out.
And then when you go over to the Iliamna freshwater population, are you treating?
All bets are off.
Okay, that I was wondering about that.
I mean, it's an area of interest for the National Marine Mammal Lab. I know they're looking at it. And so when we did the surveys, we recorded, some obvious environmental covariates, the temperature, wind speed, and things like that. There's been a little bit of work done in the lake, some monitoring of one haul out that, for instance, observed that they tended to haul out more in the afternoon and on windy days. And so that type of information is, you accumulate that slowly over time, and then you can start doing your analyses. But the obvious tidal signal isn't there.
A follow-up on this, and I think it was a little bit overlooked, is about the timings. Perhaps you can talk a little bit about the logistics, because when you do surveys during winter or when there's not much sunlight, is the window you have to do the survey is really limited, and to match that window with the tidal situation, like I'm not so sure how, when you start in Homer, let's say, and you fly over, like how much time do you really have for a survey in winter, let's say? I mean, has that situation occurred, that you have a timing window issue, and how have you dealt with that?
In terms of the helicopter surveys, they're all flown out of Iliamna, and it's about I think around 25-minute flight to the coast. We try to do everything within 2 hours on either side of high tide, again, to minimize impacts to seals. And it has had a bit of an effect in that in our December and January surveys, we basically just do one in each of those months. To some extent, that's all. Part of it is because of light. Light does become limiting, and we try to be out there when we have the maximum amount of light to do the surveys. But the other issue is the folks who work at Iliamna, they work like dogs, those people out there, and they basically take, I think it's around mid-December to mid-January, the whole place pretty much closes down. So it actually benefits us because we don't even have to worry about doing a survey during the period when we're at the absolute nadir of the amount of light.
for statements, and I mean, if you only have a 2-hour window, like how meaningful gets that if you want to characterize a population at that event doing 24 hours, but you only have 2-hour window? I mean, that's isn't that a little bit short? Like how meaningful are these surveys then when you really have to schedule them just between 11 and 1 o'clock, I assume, during the day?
You have to spend a lot of time looking at tide tables to find the optimal times in which you can get out there to do it. There are certain times when, if we have weather issues, where sometimes a storm gets stuck in the Gulf of Alaska and drags on for days and days and days, we basically have to abandon that survey because we've gotten out of our time window in which we can do the survey. We have to wait for 2 more weeks for the next set of high tides during the month.
Another audience question? James, you could do your name again. It helps these guys. Yeah.
Have you seen any other resource project do this kind of extensive scientific study?
Question for the panelists, I think.
My answer is yes, of course. But you might speak to this. You have done more in the state.
Yeah, in my experience, this is one of the more intensive research efforts that I've run across. I mean, there's always some, pre-development work done, but this one has extended over a long period of time, and it has been heavily funded. I mean, it's a huge project over a huge area, which helps to account for that. But I would say it's on the high end of the amount of work that's been done for a development project.
I'd say that PLP has set the bar pretty high for future development work.
Yeah, I think the bar is just generally going up for all projects as more techniques are available, more information is required, more time is available, more money is available, there's global warming issues to address. So, there's increasingly greater interest in gathering more information for all projects as civilization advances.
Thank you.
Someone else?
My name's Jim Stevens, and my affiliation with the area is that I help Harry's sister operate a fish camp 5 miles below Non-Dalton on the New Halen River. She's management, I'm labor. I have 2 questions. Because we are operating on where our fish camp is at, it's on a native allotment. Any activities that we try to do on that is controlled by the Department of Interior. Recently, they've required us to do an environmental assessment of our activities, proposed activities within this small patch of land. And one of the concerns that they expressed to me at Fish and Wildlife Service was the presence of stellar eiders. They seem to think that there's a flyway that runs from Cook Inlet across Iliamna Lake and ends up down to Lower Kvichak. And I was just wondering if any of your studies had identified that, or Fish and Wildlife had identified that as a concern. Because I don't know what a stellar eider is. My familiarity with waterfowl is if they taste good or not, or if they're easy to pluck or hard to pluck. So that's my first question. It has to do with whether or not there's a flyway. The second question I have has to do with your study of the caribou populations in the area, because during the period of your study, it's at a very low, the population is extremely low in the area. And whether or not in your inventory, whether you mapped some of the existing caribou trails that are in the area, because those are quite extensive and quite prominent and easy to identify. We know anecdotally, and we also know based on traditional knowledge, that there has been a large portion of the population of caribou that would cross the New Halen River about every 5 years. There would be 5,000 to 10,000 animals that would do that kind of crossing. And that's also right there at the corridor, the proposed transportation corridor. So the other part of their survey work was whether or not you've identified areas where there was a massive amount of antler sheds. if you've encountered that in the field as an indicator of the presence over time of caribou. Those are the two questions I have for you today.
Eiders and caribou?
Take the eiders.
With respect to the eiders, I don't believe we've seen Steller's eiders in our migration surveys for the transportation corridor or the mine site. I don't think they've seen them during lake seal surveys either, have they? Does that mean they never occur there? I don't know. They could occur there in very low numbers, sporadically perhaps, but we have not recorded them yet in that area.
With some fairly extensive migratory surveys being conducted in several years, I don't think Steller's eiders were seen on freshwater at all.
No.
And I was going to say that I wonder if perhaps this point was made because there is one record of a dead Steller's eider that clearly had to be crossing the base of the Alaska Peninsula, presumably from Bristol Bay over into Cook Inlet. There's very little telemetry information on movements of Steller's eiders. The suspicion is that they come down the west coast of Alaska on down into those lagoons on the north side of the Alaska Peninsula, and they molt there in the late summer and fall. Some may cross over directly over the peninsula onto the Pacific side. Some of them end up on the Pacific side, and some somehow miraculously make it to southern Kamishak Bay, although it's not clear whether they've flown all the way around the Alaska Peninsula or if some have come across. Like these guys say, we have no direct information on migratory crossing of the area, but there is one record of a dead bird that I suspect is what this question is related to. But they do show up in southern Kamishak Bay, and my interpretation has always been that they spread northward as summer turns to fall and the weather gets worse, just as the sea otters do. It may be that some are that more than we're aware of are crossing that area, crossing the peninsula, but we know of there is no direct information other than this one bird that we're aware of.
But Phil Berna from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is sitting back there if you want to talk to him in person about what they're thinking.
Yeah, so the other part of this, the other question you touched on was, the caribou being at low abundance and using other types of information to than radio tags to further distribution and habitat use.
We did some transect surveys, as I described yesterday and today. We also, I don't know if you were here yesterday, but I presented the results of an analysis of 30 years of telemetry data from radio tracking the Mulchatna caribou from the early 80s to about 2010. That's the data set that we had available to us for this report. And that included the period of increase and then decrease in the population. And we split out the different seasonal distribution maps in by decade, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and then an overall look at range use. We did map caribou trails in the mine study area, in the area of our transect surveys. I know that I've heard reports of numbers of caribou getting across the New Halen. I think the year that sticks out, I think, was something along the order of 2000, 2001. I'm not sure, but sometime since 2000, in one winter, I was told by a local resident that there had been a fair number right there around the road between, up from New Halen along the river. Have we tried to survey shed antlers? No. It's an interesting idea. I know the presence of antlers has been used to look at historical patterns in use of calving grounds because females shed antlers. And people have done some radiocarbon dating to look at long history of use of calving grounds. I don't know that it's been used for wintering areas, but it's possible. It could be it could be challenging to try and find them. You'd have to do a lot of groundwork. Just in the flying around that we've done, I can't recall seeing, many shed antlers. You'd have to fly pretty low and cover the ground pretty intensively, which might get people upset with you if you're in a helicopter. But it's an interesting idea, but it hasn't been done.
Other question? Go ahead, Kirk.
Kirk Nordstrom, U.S. Geological Survey. Since this is, as far as I know, the last panel that we have planned, or the Keystone is planned for a review of the EBD, I thought it might be appropriate to just very quickly say a few perhaps more philosophical comments, and which may or may not need any responses. That's up to the consultants and the panelists. But these are things that have struck me, that we find ourselves asking questions like, what is a baseline study really? I think all of us had some concept of what this meant when we came into it, whether we were people working on it, people reviewing it. I've been involved in baseline studies myself. I led a big project for about 5 years. And I think each baseline study that happens is a bit different in certain fundamental ways from others. But we wonder, when is the data sufficient? And what do we mean by that? Sufficient for what? What is the purpose? And I didn't think that at this point in time I'd be asking those kind of questions, but I find that I am. And I think I'm asking those questions because this particular project is certainly of very substantial scope and time period over which the data has been collected. And we've dug more into almost what we think is every important aspect of an environmental baseline study that rarely, if ever, has been done before. And we're also in a dialogue process, or at least we're in a process of openly and transparently discussing, what went well, the project, where are there gaps, where are there flaws, what could be improved. I think this is all helpful information. But we're also beginning to wonder, at what point do you say, that's it, we have what we need? And that question is not easy to answer because we don't know exactly what the objective is to the point where we can answer it. But isn't that often the situation with any project? You don't always know everything in advance, and so it's hard to plan, and so you do the best job that you can. And what I like about this is that there's continuing monitoring of some things to help continue to try and answer some of those questions that we feel are the important ones that should be focused on. One could say that baseline or characterization is a collection of data. Well, you have to start with data. But one of the funny things is that you have some idea about what processes go on in nature or what happens or what things are important. In other words, you never divorce your fact collecting from your theories about things. So, yeah, we could say that baseline is basically collecting a bunch of important information about the environment, whether it be water balances, water chemistry, whether it be populations of various animals, whether it be the predictability and likelihood of earthquakes and so forth. There's a lot of things involved here. I'm glad the questions were raised about how do we integrate this stuff? There's also a question of, do we need to integrate this stuff? As a scientist, I think, yeah, it's really important to integrate this stuff. But again, what's the objective and how far do we go? Because we could be spending an awful lot of time integrating a whole lot of data. I don't think there's anybody in this room that has got their mind completely wrapped around all the data and how that data might be linked to other data. So there's a problem there of how to define how far we go, whether we're integrating data, coordinating data, whether we're synthesizing information. For example, one step beyond basic data is interpretation. And this has come up, and I think if there's any publication of papers from this, that there's going to be some interpretation, hopefully to answer some questions that haven't really been answered very well. One thing, for example, is in terms of toxicology, we always talk about the source of a contaminant, its pathway, its receptor. How far down that road have we gone with this data? Have we gone far enough that we think that that's an adequate characterization or baseline of information against which we can compare consequences of a mining activity? Maybe that's a question that some of you might comment on. And finally, another issue here is not only are there hardly any studies of this size and scope, but there's hardly any in which there's been a dialogue process. There's been a process of open review and comments that have involved the public. And what about that? Has that been a useful approach? Is that something that we've learned some lessons from that maybe we should continue in the future for situations like this one? Well, again, probably the answers are going to come out a few years down the road. We don't know that much right now, but it's something we're thinking about. Thanks.
Reactions from panel members?
Quick comment. Sometimes I have the feeling that people see the situation here as a precedent, as something really new and really earth-shaking. In reality, if you look back on the history of the human footprint, okay, the situation we're all in right now is that these discussions are not new. They have been around for over 50 years. And mostly we know the history, we know the outcome. So I don't like to see this as a unique situation here that only has happened in Alaska. That has happened in many places in the world. Everybody who's involved probably knows about other places where we have almost an identical discussion. And it would be very helpful, I think, also for us to see where we're going and what the question actually is, to take the history and the context into account.
Anybody else?
I would say that in my experience, this is an unusual approach to have this type of review panel. I can't think of another project that I've been involved with where this has been done. And I think the dialogue is useful. Probably would have been more useful earlier in the project in terms of getting some studies designed and allaying some concerns. But be that as it may, the idea about a baseline really does vary with the audience or the expectations of what people consider to be a baseline. In this case, for the consultants, it was like you're preparing a description of, baseline conditions before development of this project, specifically for a NEPA assessment, National Environmental Policy Act assessment, which is basically talking about. The chapter would be called the affected environment or the existing environment. That was the charge from Pebble. I know that a lot of other people have the expectation that, well, this is a baseline against which you compare future change, and so it should be, more rigorous across the board for all species and all possible scenarios with regard to any potential changes that might occur, so that you can measure those, and that. That's more along the lines of what some of us were referring to as a monitoring study. So, yeah, you do have to be careful about the terms and to be sure that everyone shares the same understanding of what you're talking about.
I think Pete had some comments as well.
Yeah, and thinking about this and trying to think of something analogous to it, I find this to be a very enlightening exercise because I don't have a history of doing this kind of thing with an open public forum. But if you recall the whole oil spill history in this country, going back to the 60s, there was a lot of concern about what the effect of oil pollution was doing to our coastal environments. And there were a number of meetings held back when I first started doing research at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center of oil spill meetings that went on all over the country. But these were primarily government agencies. They weren't public meetings. Now, the public was never excluded, and some people did show up, but not like this. Just a few people would show up, usually people that came to annoy or to heckle us while we were trying to develop some type of process. And that was the only public input we got in those days. And it started in the mid and late 70s. And that by the time Exxon Valdez had happened, there was already a fairly well-developed coastal system involving the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Coast Guard, and EPA, with jurisdictions all set up all along the coastal part of the country. And what did it consist of? It consisted of an inventory of natural resources. It consisted of designating responsibilities for response. It consisted of jurisdictional decisions being made. And it wasn't easy, but that kind of system was put into place. And then after Exxon Valdez, we had the Oil Spill Act of 1990, which basically said oil was a separate thing. It was governed by the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, and we went forward. And even today, that's kind of a unique thing. But there was a long-term process there, and it did involve meetings, preparatory meetings where you collect a lot of information, you inventory it, you make it available to the resource agencies. Not involving the public, but it's the same kind of concept that Pebble is trying to go through here. You're starting by collecting information as best you can, and you try to prepare yourself. That's the important thing, is to prepare yourself for what you know could happen. And if you do a good job of that, you can respond. If you don't do a good job of it, the response isn't going to be all that great. But I like this. I think it's very good. I think it's great for public relations. And it's probably going to have some benefits with regard to adversarial relationships. If you don't do this, you don't have any trust. And people throw rocks at each other. If you talk before, you don't throw as many rocks. And I see that as a huge benefit.
Thanks, Pete. Other questions from the audience? Okay. Yeah, I think we can probably stop here. We'll come back for the panel discussion in a few minutes. I think Charlotte has a few parting words. Is that right? Oh, I can do it after the panel discussion. Well, no, we're next on the schedule is a break, and then we'll come back and do the panel discussion. So that's good. Okay. So let's break for 15 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll have wrap-up thoughts from the panel.